they are doing. But again, they're also criminals. And you have Ellis Jr. That's him and his dad up there. Ellis Jr. worked for the state motor fuel tax department at the time and would be the go-between between his father and everybody else. He would go to New York, Ellis Parker stayed in Mount Holly, but he would go to New York and be the one kind of giving direction based on what his dad would tell him to do. He would do pretty much anything his dad said. It was his personality. He thought his dad was God. Dad told him to jump off a bridge, he probably would. That's just the way it was. But he had to stay out of view from Paul Wendell, because Wendell had met him before, and would know that Ellis Parker is behind this whole ordeal. So he has to stay out of view from him, which I would think was not very easy to do. So they go to New York. They arrest Wendell. They take him to the basement of a house. They handcuff and lock him in that basement to a bench. And they start basically torturing him. So they ask him if he's going to write a confession, and he says no. So they block off windows, open and close them periodically, so he's not really sure what time of day it is. They kept putting cotton in his ears and pulling it out so he couldn't hear cars. So he would be completely disoriented, not really know where he was, what time it was, how long he'd been there, anything like that. They also tied his legs to the bench and pinned his arms to his chest with straps. They burnt his face with a light bulb. They weren't very nice to Paul Wendell, let's put it that way. So this went on for about a week. And every day, these three men would walk into the room in the basement and ask him if he was ready to confess. And he would say no. And they literally would turn around and walk out. So Wendell caught on that they aren't calling the shots. Somebody's telling them what to do, because when he says no, every single time, they walk out, come back in, and then like torture him some way. Somebody is telling them, but he doesn't know who. He has no idea who's behind it. So eventually, that's the newspaper clipping, that's the building he was held in. Eventually, he signs a confession. So he writes a confession that's 25 pages long and has quite general information in it through most of it. It's kind of blah, nothing too specific about what he did. And he lies in the first sentence. The very first sentence, he writes that he was at his sister's house before he went to the Lindbergh house, knowing that if they ask his sister, she's going to say he was never there. The confession is now out the window because you can't trust anything in it once the first sentence is a lie. So he realized that. He also details his entire childhood and his early life, like trying to rationalize why he's messed up enough to do a crime like this. But there's a lot of inconsistencies in it to what was actually found to be factual evidence at the crime scene. He claims he wore gloves to commit the crime. He also claims that he used a thumbtack to hold the ransom note onto the windowsill. There's no thumbtack holes in the note. When the note was found, there was a German mug, I can't remember if there was, like a beer stein, there we go, on top of it, holding it onto the window so it wouldn't blow out the window. He claims that he left through the front door of the house, and the reason nobody heard him is because he took his shoes off. So he carried this child, who was almost 2 years old, and his shoes out the front door right past the Lindberghs in their living room, and they had no idea. And that child never made a sound that a stranger was taking him away. That's a little hard to believe. He claims that the death of the baby was accidental. He also claims that he could speak German, which they find out he really can't. And he claims that the amount of ransom money that he's claiming is in the letter is not consistent to what the ransom notes actually are saying, what they were asking for. So there's a lot of things in there that don't necessarily add up. But he still wrote a confession. So he comes to Mount Holly. By February, the end of February of 1936, Wendell comes to town. And this is the note that he signs for Ellis Parker. Because I'm willing to stay in your custody until the investigation is concluded. So Parker has him convinced when he comes to town, he's going to send him to 4 Mile Colony to New Lisbon, to keep him safe on 24-hour watch till Parker can clear his name and figure out this whole mess. What he's really doing is keeping him there until he can get people to believe that he has the real Lindbergh baby killer. But Wendell doesn't realize that. So they have him rewrite his confession and take out a bunch of information and shorten it. And his son agrees with his confession. Parker takes the confession to the son, the same one that said, yeah, my dad could probably do this, and says, read this and let me know if there's anything in it that doesn't add up. And his son says, nope, sounds just like my dad. So he has something going. But his plan starts to fall apart. So what ends up happening is, remember Gus Lockwood, his assistant? That's one of the guys Parker asked to watch Wendell on this 24-hour watch. Feels he can trust him. Well, one night he gets off from his time watching him and he goes to the bar. And what do men do when they drink? They talk. Exactly, and brag. So he's saying, Ellis Parker has Paul Wendell, and I just got done watching him. We're going to get him convicted. And everybody was like, excuse me? He did what? So now, the cat's out of the bag that Wendell's at 4 Mile Colony being held, not to clear his name, but to get him arrested. One of the attorneys, Attorney Willens, does not believe the confession whatsoever. He was one of the attorneys in the Hopman case, and says this confession is total crap, means nothing. They turn Wendell over to Mercer County on embezzlement charges, and Parker tries to get the Lindbergh kidnapping piece and the confession tied into those embezzlement charges, and the judge says you can't do that. They have nothing to do with each other. They have to be two separate cases. But they do ask Parker to testify at the embezzlement case, but he refuses to do so. Willens has Wendell sign a document that the confession was forced out of him, and he details everything that went on in the basement of that house. But the state police are given 48 hours to investigate the kidnapping, because Governor Hoffman isn't convinced that Bruno Hauptmann is the real person they should be executing for this crime. He's not too sure. He won't come right out and admit that they potentially have the wrong guy, because he is up for re-election right after this. And he said, it could go bad no matter what I say. So he's like kind of keeping his mouth shut. But he does give them a 48-hour chance to reinvestigate, and gives Hauptmann a stay of execution again. And what ends up happening is Wendell's kidnapping charges get dropped completely. So Wendell then identifies the 3 men that are coming in and out of the room when he is there. He is able to identify Gleefield, Wise, and Schlossman, and is released on $10,000 bail. He also takes the police to the basement, to the room that he was held in. This was him pointing up to the ceiling. What he did when he was in there, well, the criminals, first of all, weren't very smart. But they blindfolded him until they were about 3 blocks from the house, then they took the blindfold off. So, and apparently there was a hospital on the route to the house with this big yellow tower. So he was able to tell the police, I drove past a yellow tower somewhere in Brooklyn, and they took him right where he needed to be. But while he was there, what he did is he got them to agree, before he would come to Mount Holly, to let him take a shower and to take his clothes to the dry cleaners. So while they were gone, he showered in the house and could then look out the windows, and now he's roaming the whole house. And he carved his initials into the door jamb of the basement door. He also, when they brought him his clothes back, the dry cleaning tag was still in the collar. He took it off and stuck it underneath the bench. So now there's evidence he was there. So he took the police there and showed them that. First person to get arrested was Martin Schlossman. He's arrested in April of 1936. And he talks about Ellis Jr. being involved. There are indictments that are brought in from Kings County, New York, against all 4 men. except for Ellis Sr. He's the only one that nobody has put together that he is the mastermind behind this whole thing. Liefeld and Wise are finally arrested. They knew they were involved, but it took them a little while to actually get to them. But they are finally arrested in May of 1936. So now, the Parkers are going to be indicted. So June 2nd, they finally give up that Ellis Parker is involved in all of this, and he is arrested on the front steps of the Mount Holly Elks by a Mount Holly police officer and released on $250 bail. $250. It was like a total scam of an arrest. Hoffman asked that they do not be extradited to New York. They wanted the trial to take place particularly in Burlington County for him. They felt like if his trial's in Burlington County, no jury's ever going to convict the Parkers of a crime. It didn't work that way because it's a federal crime now to kidnap somebody. This was 10 years earlier, he would have been all good. Kidnapping 10 years earlier carried a 1-month sentence if you kidnapped a person. After the Lindbergh Kidnapping, it was a serious crime. It became the Lindbergh Law, and kidnapping is now a big deal. The Parkers are one of the first people to get indicted under the Lindbergh Law. So they appealed their first court case due to the fact that there are a lack of Negroes on the jury. Didn't work, but they tried. They also plead not guilty to everything. Liefeld, Schlossman, and Wise plead guilty and testify against Ellis Jr. and Ellis Sr. And they are all sentenced to 20 years in Sing Sing in New York for assault on Paul Wendell. So Parkers go to trial. This is the prosecution. John Quinn and Hubert Harrington are the prosecutors for this particular trial. And their whole thing is that he did this to gain a promotion. There was a lot of talk at this point that Parker was in line for Hoover's job with the federal government. Parker claims he wants nothing to do with that job, but that is what they are going for. So they call in a bunch of witnesses. One is the secretary, Anna Bading. Throughout her entire career with him, she takes impeccable notes. She doesn't miss a deep breath the man takes. She didn't transcribe anything from when they supposedly deputized these men. Why? If she thought it was okay and it was legal, there should be evidence of it happening. They also talked to Paul Wendell, who talks about his kidnapping, the torture, and the confession. They also talked to Gus Lockwood about his time overseeing Wendell. And they talked to the 3 men that were in there who identified Parker in detail what they did as well. And they talked to David Willens, who says if Parker has so much evidence against Paul Wendell, why didn't he testify in his embezzlement case? The evidence they have against him is bruises on Paul Wendell are consistent with what the other people are testifying took place. And there's telephone records from Mount Holly to Brooklyn during the time that Wendell claims he was in this basement. So they have pretty good proof that something was going on. Parker's side, the defense, he had James Mercer Davis, George Stiltzer, Harry Green, and Harry Weinberger as his defense. And they are going to deny any involvement whatsoever. That is their whole thing. Now, the state's lawyer actually told them, don't deny involvement in it. He's guilty. What you got to do is convince them that Wendell is actually guilty of the Lindbergh crime and he did it for the benefit of the whole. He won't get in as much trouble. Present his whole case against Paul Wendell for the Lindbergh kidnapping through this trial. Say he's guilty, but explain why. And he'll get off a lot easier. And Parker said, no, I will never admit that I'm guilty of a crime. I'm not doing it. So he refuses to plead guilty. They say he has nothing to do with it. Their witnesses are mostly character witnesses, people he has worked with in the past who say all the wonderful things he has done throughout his entire career and how many people he has helped and how wonderful of a person he is. And Clifford Kane, who actually takes over for Parker later on, who claims that he was with Parker when Paul Wendell was kidnapped, which is highly likely because he said, do it at this time. He's sitting in New Jersey while they're in New York doing it. So most likely that was the case. So they put Parker on the stand, which again was a big mistake. He details, bless you, he details how he got a call from the suspected killer, who he believed it was Paul Wendell, and how Wendell offered to help in the case. He denies meeting the other 3 people that are involved in this. Says he's never seen them before. He doesn't only say that he wasn't involved with them in this way. He says he's never been involved with them at all, and there's proof that he was. He's worked on trials that they were involved in before. And this is his quote when he started asking him too many questions. He said, "I don't have to answer to anyone when I investigate a case. Leave me alone. Stop asking me too many questions." So now he sounds arrogant, right? So the conclusion of his case, the closing arguments for the prosecution are the same thing as the opening. He does it in order to gain a promotion. Defense, their whole claim is that Wendell would have been tried if Hoffman was not. And that Murray Gleefeld cannot be trusted. He's an ex-criminal with a rap sheet a mile long. How do you take his testimony? The charge to the jury is very interesting in this case. In order to find the Parkers guilty, 3 things need to happen. They need to prove that Wendell was kidnapped, so he was taken across state lines against his will. They also need to prove that he is held for ransom or some sort of reward, and that he was taken into that basement without him knowing why. So all 3 of those things need to be proven, or the jury needs to believe happened, in order for him to be found guilty. If any of those are questionable, they're not guilty. The biggest one was the ransom and reward. That was the biggest question, because yes, it was a kidnapping, but it was not a kidnapping for money, like you normally hear of a kidnapping. So there's no ransom notes. Nobody's looking for Paul Wendell when this is going on. So what's the reward in it? And they said the reward was working for this CIA. Parker getting a promotion. They're claiming that's the reward. So they end up being found guilty. The jury comes in, the jury foreman actually comes into the judge and says, is it possible, are we allowed to ask for leniency? And the judge says you can ask, but it doesn't have to be granted. And they come back with a guilty verdict with a recommendation for leniency, which they get. They do get the leniency. Ellis Sr. is sentenced to 6 years. Ellis Jr. is sentenced to 3. They would go to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And there was a lot that goes on after they're found guilty, because a lot of people really don't think the Parkers belong in prison. So there were a lot of appeals that were filed. Both of them are released on bail. Petitions were written in order to try and make it that they would not go to prison for this. They said Ellis Parker was having some health issues, and there were petitions upon petitions signed saying if he goes to jail, he won't survive. His health can't handle it. Do not let him go to prison. Letters written about his character from everybody from senators and Supreme Court judges down to his next door neighbor. Wendell writes a book called The Hoffman-Lindbergh Aftermath and makes some money on the whole story. He also sues the governor in the state of New Jersey for defamation. He does not win, but he sues them. And everybody ends up being indicted in New York as well. The indictment in New York gets thrown out pretty quick because it's double jeopardy. They've already been tried for this case somewhere else. They can't be tried again and found guilty a second time. They put in a final appeal to the Supreme Court that listed 483 claims in it, and it was denied. Their conviction was upheld on April 11th of 1939, and they would go to prison. Parker's health was, like I said, severely deteriorating, and he has a stroke not long after he's there. So they go in April 11. There's a big petition that goes out to have both of them pardoned as well. And unfortunately, by January of 1940, Ellis Parker passes away in federal prison. He never bounced back from the stroke. He was in the infirmary pretty much the rest of the time that he was there. He is buried in Mount Holly Cemetery. He had his funeral out of his home. At the time, it was on Garden Street in town. His original house was right on High Street, but during all of the trials, his wife sold it to make money to help his court case. So they moved into a smaller home. So this is, the pictures there are the gentleman with that hand on the hat. That is Governor Hoffman coming out of the Parker's residence from the viewing. The other picture is Mrs. Parker, Ellis Jr.'s wife, Ellis Jr., who now looks exactly like his father. And the guy behind them is the guard from somebody that was sent with him from Lewisburg so that he can attend his father's funeral. This is the actual burial. The pallbearers, 90% of them are county employees. They had a sheriff, they had the head of buildings and grounds, the head of the highway department, there was the Mount Holly chief of police at the time, were all his pallbearers. They said that there were anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people that came to his funeral. Everybody from childhood friends to famous people showed up. A lot of the Philadelphia Athletics showed up at his funeral for some reason. Not quite sure how he knew all of them, but they showed up at the front door. The interesting one was Bruno Hauptmann's wife. So while all of this is going on, Bruno Hauptmann gets executed for the Lindbergh kidnapping. His wife comes to Parker's viewing. Now, Ellis's wife very rarely came downstairs during the viewing. She kind of hid upstairs, wanted nothing to do with people at that moment. And when Mrs. Hauptmann walked in, somebody went upstairs and told her that she was in the house. So she came down just to see her. And supposedly she walked up to Ellis's body, put her hands on him and said, "Thank you for everything you've ever done for my husband," and left. Again, there were petitions that were signed for him to be posthumously pardoned and also for Ellis Jr. to be pardoned, which does happen. Ellis Jr. gets pardoned eventually. Ellis Sr. still waiting. So this is what happens to everybody that was involved after 1940. So Charles and Ann Lindbergh never go back to their home in Hopewell after this kidnapping takes place. They end up moving to England. Eventually they move to Hawaii, where they both die and are buried. They do have other children. It would not be their only child. Anna Hauptmann, Bruno Hauptmann's wife, works her entire life for exoneration of her husband and sues New Jersey for wrongful death. She doesn't die until the late 1980s. She lived for a long time without her husband, and up until the day she dies, she insists that he had nothing to do with it and knows nothing. Mark Kimberling, who was one of the gentlemen on the scene originally, eventually becomes the head of the state police force. Judge William Clark, who was the judge for the Hauptmann trial, he becomes the head of the Circuit Court of Appeals, goes on to serve in World War II, and becomes the Chief Justice of Allied Appeals Court at Nuremberg. Norman Schwarzkopf becomes a brigadier general and trains the Iranian police force. He also works for the New Jersey Department of Law and Safety, and probably something most people don't know anything about. He narrated a radio crime show called Gangbusters. Yeah. Big claim to fame. Governor Hoffman starts to work after he is no longer governor, for the New Jersey Employment Compensation Commission and confesses to embezzling $300,000 from that commission the day before he is found dead. He writes a note to his daughter saying, I embezzled all this money, and the next day he's found dead in his house. So, the other culprits in this whole ordeal, Murray Bleefeld is eventually also indicted for filing false payroll claims. So he spends more than his 20 years in Sing Sing. But he promises the real story, as he calls it, to an author, Philip Scaduto, and they write a book called Scapegoat. Martin Schlossman is also indicted for filing false payroll claims, and all of them serve out their full sentence in Sing Sing. Now, Paul Wendell, what happens to this lovely man? So he goes to work for Dr. Benedict Lust. He does some interesting things. He becomes a doctor of metaphysics from the Church of the Divine Metaphysics. You're probably going, what in the world does that mean? Basically, at the time, he becomes a chiropractor when it wasn't considered a doctor. When you were a chiropractor in 1940, you were considered a quack, basically. You were like, working magic on people. That is what he did. He then eventually ends up committing fraud and goes to prison for 6 months because while he is practicing, chiropractic becomes recognized as a doctor. He does not get a license, but he continues to practice. So he gets in trouble for practicing without a license. He also self-publishes a few books that are a little weird. Bloodless Surgery Techniques and Treatments, Father Knapp's Health Teachings, and Standardized Naturopathy. The interesting thing with these books is, how on the back you write, like the author writes about themselves and their little bio. Every single time he writes that he is the Paul Wendell associated with the Lindbergh Kidnapping. He uses that until the day he dies. So the Parkers, this is a picture of the whole Parker family, Ellis, his wife, and all of their children. Cora Parker, his wife, will live at her home on Garden Street for another 10 years. She will never receive a pension because he ended up losing his job due to a criminal case. There are people that petition the county to give her a pension for him, and it's denied every time. One of the interesting things is that until the mid-50s, she received a Christmas card every year from an anonymous person from Brooklyn. And in it, it was just signed, "Hope you had a better year," and that was it. The card stopped the year Paul Wendell died. So people believe he was sending them to her kind of as a, yeah, I probably did do this, and I'm really sorry I got your husband involved and that this happened. And you kind of had to deal with the repercussions. Ellis Parker Jr. is paroled on good behavior in October of 1941. By January of 1947, he receives a federal pardon from President Truman. And he dies in 1972 and orders that all of his papers are destroyed. Ellis Sr. did the same thing. So did Anna Bating, the secretary. All three of them asked that everything gets burned, buried, goodbye. Because they believed that there were a lot of things in there that would make a lot of prominent people very, very angry, and they were not going to be around to defend themselves anymore or to state the case and all the facts. So they had it all destroyed. So there's not much left that relates to all of this and Parker's involvement in it, unfortunately, because of that. So they're still working to get Ellis Sr. a pardon. At the time, posthumous pardons were unheard of. They weren't done before in the country. Now that they're a little more common, his grandson is continuing the fight to get him a federal pardon. He has letters from doctors, lawyers, all kinds of stuff, people who have reviewed the whole case. From today's viewpoint, one of the things that came out was that Parker may have had a brain tumor that was clouding his judgment based on where it was, and they refused in his trial to allow his doctors to testify. They wanted to put the doctors on the stand to talk about his medical condition, and the court said no. So that stuff is put into the pardon, has never made it through all the way. It gets to the pardon office, has yet to make it to a president. But we'll see. Maybe one of these days it'll happen and his name will be cleared for all the good stuff that he did do, and the one thing that he was not so good will go away, but we'll see. So, anybody have any questions about it?
Yeah, real quick, wasn't there an attorney named Robert Peacock involved somehow in proceedings?
Not in this case, no.
I'm sure it was in Mount Holly.
Yeah, I know there was a Peacock that was involved in the county system, but wouldn't have been involved in this particular case.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've heard the name before. Anything else?
David Willett, when he came, like, his law firm's like the largest law firm in the state.
Right.
Yeah, it was like, he definitely made a name for himself.
Yes.
I just wanted
Of
something.
course, a lot of people made names for themselves. Yeah.
But they were so careful in the prosecution of Ellis Parker, but not about Hopkins. So much shoddy prosecution there.
Very much so. I think with Hopman, they had a guy, he fit the bill. And if they would have came out and said, this isn't really him, the backlash that they would have received, and they knew Hopman couldn't defend himself. He didn't have the means to hire himself a really good lawyer that could have got him off of this. He fit the bill. He barely spoke English. He was a carpenter. He had everything, except for the fact that he probably actually committed the crime.
Has anyone ever claimed to be the Lindbergh baby?
Yes.
I thought so.
A couple of times there have been people out there who have said they think they are the Lindbergh baby. The one story that I heard or read about that made me kind of start to think more was where somebody, I think it was the butler's girlfriend, like the Lindbergh's butler's girlfriend, who had just been in the house, several times. She was in Coney Island several years after this, and a woman was walking down the boardwalk with a 12-year-old child, and she said she stopped the woman because it was impeccable how much they looked like the Lindberghs, the blonde curly hair, all of that, and said, "Is that Charles Lindbergh Jr.?" And the lady looked at her eyes got real wide, grabbed the kid and was like, "We gotta go," and took off down the boardwalk. And I'm like, well, if it really wasn't him, why would you run away so fast? Wouldn't you at least come up with a story? Like something. But it's like she panicked. So there are a lot of people who believe that that was not the actual Lindbergh baby that they found.
The fact that you would find a baby's body a mile off the road to go to
It's
the
very
bathroom.
suspicious that somebody
And
went that far.
An orphanage
Yeah.
had a child missing, and the fact that the father got rid of the body so quick.
Yes. Yeah, it's